There we go.
Okay, folks. I went I went through the countdown. I thought I was live, but I was not live. But I am now live, and I'm going to continue going through the transcript and do commentary on the show. The video that was produced, by Radhika Desai and Michael Hudson, uh, and also by Mick Dunford. It was a very interesting and fascinating video. It was the ninth geopolitical economy hour that they were doing. So Radhika introduces herself, and Michael Hudson introduces himself. They both are professors of economics. In Michael Hudson's case, he's a university professor at University of actually Missouri at Kansas City, and Radhika is a professor at the University of Manitoba in Canada. Both are very distinguished research scholars and teachers as well. Radhika says, and today we have a special guest, Professor Mick Dunford, who's Professor Emeritus at Sussex University and a visiting scholar at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and his work focuses on world development, especially of Eurasia and China. Mick is going to help us to discuss the political and geopolitical economy today of the Ukraine conflict. Conflict is dragging on. The much anticipated spring offensive has started and is sputtering, as I also said just a little while ago when I started things off. Before I actually started the video, Western propaganda is beginning to portray what we know is, in many cases, a bloodbath for Ukraine as a triumph. President Zelensky is jetting around the European capitals and eliciting very uncertain promises of help. Western powers are filling Ukraine with what somebody recently called a zoo of incompatible weapons and weapon systems of different vintages. I believe it was Colonel Douglas Macgregor who was the author of that particular metaphor, but I've heard it from Scott Ritter also, so it is going around. The EU continues imposing ever newer sets of sanctions, while President Biden continues to proclaim his support for Ukraine's cause as long as it takes to regain its 1991 borders, which of course includes Crimea. So all of this is going on. We know there is much that is puzzling about the conflict, and today what we want to do is follow the money on the conflict. Wars are not just fought with arms, strategies, and tactics. Armies march, as they say, on their bellies. So what is political and geopolitical economy of this conflict? And Radhika says, while the mainstream press makes it sound as if the West is involved in the conflict entirely altruistically, standing up for Western values and democracy, even as it supports, by the way, an ever more fascist government in Kyiv, a few critical sources do focus on the profits that are being made by arms production. But what we think we will be able to show in the course of this hour is that, in fact, the underlying political economy and geopolitical economy is far more complex. So what we've decided to do is organize the conversation by country and region. We'll first discuss the points relating to Ukraine. Then we'll come to Russia. Then we'll come to Europe. Then we'll go to the United States. Then we'll discuss China, and then the rest of the world. So that's roughly how we want to do it. And so, beginning with Ukraine, what I find really remarkable about the whole sort of economic situation in Ukraine is that normally, when a country is at war, you'd expect that country pulls together. The government creates policies that are egalitarian. Some of that happened in World War One, but certainly in World War II, in this country, we had a government that was creating policies that were very egalitarian in the Second World War. There were laws against not pulling together when it came to rationing, and when it came to price controls or paying wage controls. There were people who went to jail over these laws. There was enforcement of people pulling together, and indeed they did pull together very well. Okay, in the Second World War. Okay, Radica points out here that in the course of the conflict in the Second World War in Britain, there was talk of fair shares and equal sacrifices, and as I just said, there was a lot of talk of that kind here in the United States, and more than talk, there were laws, there were people put in jail for not pulling together. But you find in Ukraine now is absolutely the opposite. What you are looking at in Ukraine is what we may call neoliberalism on steroids. I don't think I've heard anyone before make that point with respect to this conflict. Of course, people mostly focus on the military. There has been talk of the corruption in relation to resale of weapons to all the places on the earth, and also to certainly the producers of arms getting rich. But we haven't heard of something so comprehensive that it would be spoken of as neoliberalism on steroids. Going further, okay, the Zelensky government, even and is conducting a war, which is very often a kind of show war, quote unquote, anyway, but it is supposedly at war. It is fighting a great enemy. Meanwhile, the government is implementing exceedingly anti-labor legislation. It has banned the opposition that will try to resist that, and it is privatizing all sorts of state assets in order to finance a war. Now, that is not something we did here in the United States. We certainly froze strikes and things like that, but there was an attempt to be equitable towards labor in the Second World War, and in no way were we and the British and other allies in the Second World War privatizing all sorts of state assets in order to finance the war. During the war, the gold standard was suspended, and the governments created the money needed to finance the war. As Radica says here, so you're essentially selling off the family silver in order to pay for an ongoing expense. What's more, the privatization includes the very, very fertile land of Ukraine, and it is not being privatized to ordinary farmers or anything. On the contrary, the land is being sold off to large agribusiness, and Michael Hudson will say something further about that as we go along. So every time you hear about, how urgent it is that Ukrainian grain has to get out to the world markets, it is not the interest of ordinary farmers that are being protected, Ukrainian farmers. On the contrary, these big agribusinesses must get their products out for sale. So this is what is going on. And in many other ways, private enterprise is deeply involved. Every time there's a loan being given to Ukraine, private sector operators, big financial institutions are involved. And of course, the IMF is funneling money to Ukraine in various ways, and so on. Radica says, don't you think, Michael, isn't that really quite an exceptional state of things for a country at war? And Michael Hudson replies and says, And in the press discussion every day, it's obviously, it says, well, it certainly is. And in the press discussion every day, it's obviously about the military. But the military discussion about whether there's going to be a counterattack by Ukraine, the military situation is all they're really talking about. And I think that's really quite right. There are a lot of military discussions uh, that people can tune into. There's a lot. I'm sorry, I kind of screwed this up. I think I probably have it back now. Uh, is all that they're really talking about is that Ukraine has to make some victory so that it can now negotiate peace with the Russians and install exactly the neoliberal policy that you've described. There's no way that can happen, says Michael. I think we should say at the beginning what the other side has to say. And I think Russia's Foreign Secretary Lavrov made it clear on May 4th. Foreign Minister Lavrov said, quote, everyone understands the geopolitical nature of what is happening. Everyone understands that without solving the main geopolitical problem, which is the desire of the West to maintain its hegemony and dictate to everyone its will, it is impossible to solve any crisis, be it in Ukraine or in other parts of the world, unquote. So you can see right now about how the U.S. has been preparing for that every day, certainly in the New York Times and the Washington Post. There is a list of all the war crimes that Russia has been allegedly committing in Ukraine, beginning with faked the kinds of massacres, the Bucha massacre, and all of the attacks. So the U.S. is accumulating a bill that now the New York Times says is $2 trillion that Ukraine will have to pay the West in order to become solvent once the fighting is over. And the U.S. says, well, we're preparing a war crimes trial in the International Criminal Court against Russia for what this is going to be, a list of damages to charge Russia so that Ukraine can begin to pay. I got to comment on this immediately. We are not even signers of the treaty establishing the International Criminal Court. Neither we, the United States, nor the Russians are signatories of that treaty. We have some nerve saying we're already preparing a war crimes trial when we're not even a signatory to the treaty. Michael goes on, but of course the war crimes trial is going to take years and years. And in the meantime, Ukraine is going to have to sell off exactly all of its assets that you have mentioned. It'll have to sell off its agriculture to Monsanto. It'll sell off its gas rights to Chevron. The U.S. has hired BlackRock, the Wall Street firm, to make a repertory of all of the assets Ukraine has and how they will be sold to U.S. buyers. Well, the whole question is, what will happen? Will that really be sold off? Well, how can it be sold off if the sellers are a government that was installed by a coup d'etat? A government which actually itself has become a terrorist government, which it has because we know it's been guilty of terrorism in Russia itself, the assassination of certain people, specifically Daria Dugina, okay, and other assassinations have also been conducted, and there have been terrorist attacks on Russia as well. And the money that is received for these special privileges are actually turned over to the kleptocrats and to the government officials to put in their own accounts. And much of it has actually been recycled into campaigns for the U.S. Congress, the U.S. senators, and U.S. politicians. And that is sort of a key economic aspect of this that hasn't been discussed apart from Hunter Biden's laptop, where he promised to pay Hunter Biden and the big man, presumably the father, to act as lobbyists for Ukraine. And we know that much of the money that has been donated to Ukraine has been paid by Ukraine on public relations agencies and lobbyists to pay senators and representatives. But also, when you have BlackRock in charge of neoliberalizing and carving up the Ukrainian economy, the senators and congressmen can expect campaign contributions not only from Ukraine, but from BlackRock, from Chevron, from all the other companies that are able to buy a killing there. I think there he's referring to an economic killing. Well, what is the response? And I think what I want to point out is that Russia obviously needs its own criminal court. It needs a shadow court to say, yes, of course there has been the aggressor must pay reparations. The aggressor in this case is the U.S. and NATO. We are owed money. We're not the payees. So, and these assets in Ukraine, says Michael, especially in the Russian part that are now part of Russia, are not Ukraine's to sell. They are our assets now. They are Russian assets. Thank you, honey. And we are not going to sell them to the West. And we are not going to install a neoliberal program that is being proposed by the West. So there's obviously going to be a standoff for a number of years. The standoff will have to go beyond just an international criminal court by the global majority, but a whole set of counter institutions to counter, for instance, the IMF, which is lending money to Ukraine in violation of its articles of agreement. I find that a very, very telling point. Lending to a country at war, lending to a government that is anything but democratic to fight the war. So I think we may have a little back and forth here before we finish Ukraine. But to get into this, the fact that the economic solution can only be settled on the battlefield. Everybody agrees with that. The U.S. is expecting Ukraine to win enough on the battlefield so that they can say, let's stop and talk. And Russia has made it very clear. We're not going to stop and talk. We're going to continue to put our national security demands up front. And this is not something that's going to end this year or next year or even the year after. I guess I have to comment on that and say, well, it's not going to end this year unless the Russians happen to have a big victory once they destroy the latest counteroffensive by the Ukraine. Excuse me 1 second. So now Mick Dunford tries in, and he says, I just want to pick up on what Michael said about the way in which neoliberalism is seen as the way forward from this point in time. And I want to do that by talking about the way in which neoliberalism, the way in which a particular path to transition, the way in which a country in which ethnic nationalists came to power through a series of successive color revolutions, laid the foundations, many of the foundations for the current crisis. It's very interesting, you know, that in 1991, the Ukrainian ethnic nationalists, of whom Gorbachev had actually warned by Bush, envisaged that Ukraine would very quickly become another France. In fact, what happened was that Ukraine, in a sense, actually went backwards. In 1989 to 91, there were a series of transformations in Europe in which many of the communist countries in Europe collapsed and undertook transitions to capitalism. And in 1989, there was an attempted color revolution which failed in China. Here's a graphic introduced by Mick into the discussion. It's a very interesting graphic. What it does is, it indexes, the various nations that are mentioned on here from their positions in, I believe it's 1989. It gives them each a score of 100 for where they were, in 1989. And then illustrates the answer to the question, how much did their GDP grow compared to 1989? It doesn't show the graph for China, but it starts off with the China index and points out that compared to the starting score of 100, they grew by 1,480%, nearly 15 times in relation to their GDP. Of course, China wasn't using a neoliberal system, of growth. And there's Poland. Poland grew by 252%, in rough terms, or 2.5 times between 1989 and 2019. So they were second behind China. And you'll notice how in Poland, after things broke up for the communist government there, they hit a low point of roughly 81% of their index value of 100 very shortly after 1989. Let me see if I can see what year it was clearly. By 1991, they hit their low point of 81%. From then on, they began to grow, in GDP. And they were at 100% by roughly 1995. And they continued to grow from 1995 until 2019, when they were at 252%, their index value. Poland may be said to have followed a neoliberal course in relation to growth, but they also had a lot of external help from the Eurozone, and they had a lot of external help, assistance, from the United States. And this helped them to grow. They weren't relying on a neoliberal system entirely, to grow. The second country to be considered in this graph, is actually Belarus. They started at 100. They grew by 95%. Their index was roughly 195 in 2019. They didn't reach their low point, though, until roughly 1995. I can make out. So in other words, communism collapsed in that country a little more slowly than in some of the others. And then they began to grow, but they did not use a neoliberal economy to grow. Uh, they used a model that was much more active in interfering with the market. As of 2019, they had grown by 95% compared to the 100% value that they were given as of 1989. Okay, now Russia, and I'm going over this graphic in much more detail, okay, than in the video, because I find it fascinating to illustrate various things. Okay. Russia had a final index figure of 118. Uh, Not a great performance, considering they started out, okay, at 100. Okay, it was 30 years. It was over a 30-year period. But in looking at Russian performance, we have to take account of the very severe collapse, okay, of Russia. During the Yeltsin era, the economy of Russia really tanked. It went from that 100 value to what looks like here on the graph. I can't really read it because the numbers are not there. So I'm estimating. Uh, it fell to roughly 60% of where it was in 1989 when this all started. That was a severe collapse. Oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't reading the Russian graph. It fell to actually what looks like a little less than 50%, 46%, in what looks like it's 1998, that was the depth of the situation for the Russians. Then it began to grow. It's notable that in 1999, the leadership of Russia was changed from Yeltsin to Putin. So at that point, okay, it looks like Russia was at roughly 50% of the starting value, okay, of 100. So from there, it grew to 118% in 2019. So in the 20 years from 1999 to 2000, okay, in 19, okay, it more than doubled. It was Putin and his pulling together of the Russian economy, okay, that did that. And there was a lot of intervention by the government in that economy between 1999 and 2019. It certainly was not a neoliberal economy. Now, of course, there was a lot of foreign investment in Russia, but the foreign investors, after looting Russia during the 1990s, was stopped from doing that by Putin, and they had to live according to Russian rules, controlling what they did, okay, in Russia. And that was a period of substantial economic advance for Russians. Okay, as I've indicated, they went uh, from 50% up to 118%. substantial growth over that period of time. Georgia had a precipitous fall until about 1994, when things flattened out. And then Georgia's economy began to rise. It had a precipitous fall from 100 to what looks like something like 33. So it was, at its depth, a very precipitous fall. And then it went up to 82.9 as of 2019. So the Georgian economy, which wasn't run as a neoliberal economy after the collapse, also got much stronger. It grew by roughly 2.5 times. Okay. In other words, when you measure things from the low point, it looks a little different than if you just take the starting point, okay, and the ending point. Okay, now with Ukraine itself, okay, it was subject to neoliberal leadership. Western capitalists were very active, okay, in Ukraine. They had great influence, okay, on the government all through that period of time. They fell to 40% of their starting value of 100 in 1999. Okay, even in 2000, they were still there. Then they began to grow somewhat. They also had a flat period. They decreased again. They ended up with a score of 56.8. So over all that period, their performance quickly fell to 40% of its index value of 100. Then it began to rise, but even at its height, it ended up at roughly 57%. That's a 43% collapse of the economy over 30 years. In what looks like 2014, which was the year of the coup, it's either 2014 or 2015 here. Okay, it took a downward turn then, and then it slowly improved a little, but it still ended up at the 57% value. The downward turn took it to below 50%, roughly 46%. So it ended up at 56% compared to the starting value, okay, of 100. So that included the performance of the highly neoliberal government that took over after the coup in 2014. But right along, it was beset by neoliberal governments, okay, and by oligarchs. What happened in 2014 was really a total victory of oligarchs who wanted to join the West and wanted a Ukraine that would be, okay, in NATO and that would be, okay, inside of the Eurozone. They pursued those policies, but those oligarchs continue to run the government, okay, in Ukraine from 2014 up to the present. And of course, there has been very little growth since then. I'll go on with mixed comments here. Okay, I added a lengthy commentary, which I hope was useful to you. This chart simply depicts the growth of GDP in a number of these transition countries from 1989. 1989 is equal to 100. Of the East European countries, the one that did best was Poland. It reached by 2019 an index of 251.7. But Poland received, that was 151.7% increase over where they were at the starting point. But Poland received huge sums of cohesion fund support from the European Union. Of these countries, the one that did second best was actually Belarus, which did not adopt a neoliberal path. If, however, you look at Ukraine, you find that in 2019, right before the major impact of the current conflict, but obviously reflecting in part the conflict that started in 2014, stood at just 56.8% of where it was, in 1989. Now, we know that between 2019 and 2023, there's been a further collapse of the economy, of the Ukraine. We don't know what the index was, but for various reasons, we wouldn't be surprised to find that it was at 40% or 35% or 30% even now. Anyway, Mick says that represents a catastrophic economic collapse as a result of the path of transition that was adopted in that country. If one looks at China, I record the Chinese index starting at 100 1989. In 2019 was 1480. I want you to just think about these two numbers. You can compare 251.7 for Poland, 56.8% for Ukraine, and 1,480% for China. So in a sense, this particular neoliberal path led to an economic catastrophe. It also led to a demographic catastrophe, and I, Joe Firestone, want you to pay attention to this very, very closely. In 1989, the country had 51.3 million people. In 1989 and in 1993, it had dropped to about 41 million people by 2014. In other words, the neoliberal path, even before 2014, resulted in a loss of population amounting to 10 million people. Then Mick points out today it is probably about 31 million. Now, Colonel Douglas Macgregor sharply disagrees with Mick about this. He thinks that currently, today, due to the war, due to the emigration of people outside of the Ukraine, due to the conquest of the Donbass and the annexation of those provinces by the Russians, he thinks the population of Ukraine right now is between 18 and 20 million people. I tend to believe that he, is right, because in losing the Donbass, they all alone probably lost 10 to 12 million people. And then there are the war refugees who left between 2019, and also today. And I think that's at least another 10 million people. Anyway, Mick estimates about 5.5 million refugees are in Russia. I think he meant they left for what was then Russia. And another 4 or 5 million people are in the EU. That doesn't take account of the European refugees, the Ukraine refugees who fled to Canada, and who fled to the United States and who fled to other countries that would take them. Its population has collapsed because deaths exceed births. So it has very little prospect of seeing sustained population growth in the years to come. So in a sense, I just wanted to document these economic and demographic aspects of a catastrophe that has led to this tragedy. So Radica replies and says, that's really very important. What we're seeing now in the context of the war is that these policies are actually being further enhanced, including by the fact that the Zelensky government has used the excuse of war to ban all opposition, which means that opposition to these policies cannot be voiced, essentially. And of course, what you're also saying about the demographic collapse was before and during the war, with so many refugees in Russia and elsewhere, I think it also shows that the irony of the fact is that everyone who says stand up for Ukraine and we're going to defend the Ukraine is actually contributing to the systematic destruction of Ukraine. I think she's very right about that. This is one of the ironies of the present situation. This government of Ukraine is responsible for destroying Ukraine. It could have had a peace with Russia in April of 2022. We all know this. The Turks were able to negotiate a peace agreement 2 months into the war. And this was torpedoed by the United States through a visit to Ukraine by Boris Johnson, by Bojo himself. I think he should change his name to Bobo. Okay. Another thing about the sort of political economy of all this that really strikes me as extremely, scandalously hypocritical, shockingly hypocritical, is that all the arms that are being sent, especially by the United States, but also by other countries, they're always portrayed as we are giving Ukraine arms. None of these arms are being given. The United States and other countries are selling these arms. And if Ukraine cannot pay, as it indeed cannot, they're running up a tab. At the end of this war, whatever entity that survives to which the name Ukraine can be stuck will be saddled with this bill. I don't think all the money that they will confiscate from this Russian oligarch or that Russian oligarch, central bank reserves and whatnot, will come anywhere near to paying for this. So essentially, whoever the people who remain in Ukraine will be working very hard to pay off this debt. And again, it is a debt, remember, that has been incurred for a completely illegitimate purpose. Ukraine was not very prosperous, but it would have retained what little 57% of its 1989 prosperity it had. It would have retained that substantially and maybe even done better had they signed the Minsk agreements, which of course they could have signed and enforced at any time. But no, they thought they would do better by trying to stick with the West. But the West, by egging Ukraine on not to sign the Minsk agreements, well, they did sign the Minsk agreements. They didn't actually implement them. But the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements were signed by Ukraine's government. Not necessarily by this new government of Ukraine, but by an earlier government of Ukraine. What's more, Western corporations, financial agribusiness, and all sorts are basically already profiting from it. They were profiting, as Mick, you pointed out already before this conflict began, through all the color revolutions and the implementation of neoliberal policies and so on, which goes back certainly to 2014 and much earlier than that as well. But also, in the context of the present war, while the war is going on, while the country is at war, Western corporations are benefiting by buying up productive assets and essentially exploiting Ukrainian labor essentially with a labor legislation that is totally loaded in favor of big corporations. So Michael Hudson then takes over and says, well, the question is, what is Ukraine going to be for all of this? When you talk about the neoliberalism, there's no way that this neoliberal program can be applied to Donetsk or to Luhansk, and he should have added, or to Kherson or to Zaporozhia or to Odessa, he says, if that's taken over. So what we're talking about is a kind of, it says here, rough state of Ukraine, but I think what he said was rump state of Ukraine. That's what I heard. In which it's possible even Luhansk, I think he meant to say Lvov there, may be turned over to Poland. It's actually Lviv by Ukrainian. May be turned over to Poland. In Russia, in Russian, okay, it's actually Lvov. Then he says it's going to be carved up. So the argument is going to be, what is the Ukraine that is going to pay these debts? And certainly any agreements that the proxy government has made and any debts they've run into can be repudiated on the grounds of odious debts. Now, obviously, if the United States imposes a puppet government, a client oligarchy, they're not going to raise the issue of odious debts. As he just pointed out, the political system is such that labor has no representation there. So you would have a Ukraine that's lost half of its population. Actually, it looks like it would have lost 3/5 of its population that's living abroad now, and there's nothing to go back to for it. And much of the population is in the Russian speakers. So there's going to be literally something that is not really a country. You can think of it as an economic entity that somehow controls the raw materials we've mentioned, the land that's not poisoned by uranium bullets and made but radioactive. You're talking about a kind of, not really a country. Even the definition of how to put the new laws is going to have to await a settlement of the political boundaries that I don't see happening within the foreseeable future. And Radica Desai, I'm sorry, it's actually Desai. So absolutely, I mean, basically what we're all ending up saying is that the war has simply been the occasion for further acceleration of neoliberal transformation of Ukraine. That's what the West is getting. Meanwhile, of course, ordinary Ukrainians, okay, and many of them, maybe even quite idealistic, are being signed up to go and fight and die for a cause which is not even the cause of their liberation, but a cause of the destruction of their country. I mean, this is the horrific situation in Ukraine. Maybe if we are done with Ukraine, we can. Mick, did you want to add anything more about Ukraine? Mick says, I mean, no. The only thing I would have added is that, I mean, if you look at the city of Mariupol, I mean, there's already quite a significant process of reconstruction of housing with people being provided with new accommodation. He doesn't say who by, but it's obvious that this investment in reconstruction of housing was done by Russia when it took over Mariupol. There have been, he goes on, quite major investments in transport infrastructure. There have been attempts to address the problems of water supply of the Crimea. So I suspect that those parts of Ukraine that have become parts of the Russian Federation may well see very substantial public investment in order to try to, well, so much has been destroyed, to actually restore the infrastructure and start to reestablish public services, and maybe to get some of these economic activities working again to provide people with livelihoods. I guess I've got a comment on that. It's been obvious from statements that Putin has made and actions by the Russians already in those areas they conquered that they are very serious about rebuilding these areas quickly because they're considering them to be Russian areas full of Russian people, and all the Russian people want to take care of them properly and appropriately. So Mick says, but obviously that will involve uh, massive financial investments, very careful planning. Okay, and Radica says next, absolutely, that's a good seg into our next topic, which is Russia. So I would say, what's the most general things you can say about Russia? Here, I think there were some really stunning things said if you understand Russian history at all. Well, recall that when the conflict began, President Biden claimed he was going to impose such sanctions that were going to, how did he put it, that we were going to reduce the ruble to rubble, and that we were going to set back the Russian economy, basically massively destroying the Russian economy. Instead, what we've seen is that the Russian economy has actually proved very resilient, and in fact, in many ways, the sanctions have been boomeranging, causing more harm to the imposers of the sanctions, whether it's the EU or the US itself, particularly the dollar system and so on, instead of hurting by Russia. So Russia has proved resilient against sanctions, and we all see this, by the way. This story itself goes back to 2014, because in 2014, as people may recall, a first batch of sanctions were imposed on Russia. In response to those sanctions, the Russian government did undertake a number of initiatives to essentially sanctions-proof its economy. One of the big success stories of that sanction proofing was, in fact, that the Russian agricultural sector, which in fact has proven to be a success story. And today, Russia is a major exporter, not only of grain and food products and so on, but also exports fertilizer, as we saw in an earlier phase of the conflict, when there was a great deal of concern about the disruption of supplies of fertilizer from Russia. Russia has also, over the last year or so, demonstrated a capacity for keeping up production. Yes, they have. Yes, they have. One of the other things that occurs to me, says Radica, is that in the West, with all the weapons being supplied and sold to Ukraine, the stockpiles have been depleted, whereas Russia has demonstrated the capacity to continue manufacturing weapons and essentially to win wars in Russia. Actually, there hasn't been much of a war in Russia yet. It's been in Ukraine mostly. But they have demonstrated a capacity to continue manufacturing weapons to supply an increasing number of troops. They have increased their troops that have been dedicated to the war from 200,000 to roughly, I think, current estimates of 650,000. They started with 200,000. They've now gone up to something like 650,000, whereas Ukraine started with about 650,000, and they've now gone to something like 200,000. So things have gone in the opposite direction. I have to emphasize, those new Russian troops have not all been committed to the battle yet. They've been in reserves. Okay, they've been training. They're all fully equipped with new manufacturers that the military-industrial complex of Russia has been able to provide, to them. The other weapons, the drones, the airplanes, the tanks, the artillery shells are all being produced in huge numbers that dwarf the capacity of the West to replace what Ukraine has lost. So in that sense, and the last point I'd like to make is that all this has been done in the context where the government has stepped up its level of state intervention in order to create a more productive economy, become more of a developmental state. There are many in Russia who argue that not enough has been done on this front and more can be done. The Russian central bank's policies could be more anti-neoliberal than they are. The government could also essentially mobilize the economy on a war footing, and actually, instead of how for Russia, the IMF predicted that the Russian economy would be set back by about 12 to 14%, and in the end, in 2022, it was set back by a mere 2%. But many people would argue, Sergei Glaziev is one of them, who says, actually, if you mobilize the economy, it would not only not have a setback of a mere 2%, which is certainly something to celebrate, but actually have a Russian economic boom, which could still be possible. And by the way, the projections for 2023 for the Russian economy are for considerable growth in 2023. I forget what the number is, but I think, well, I'm not going to say because I don't actually remember what that forecast was, but it's substantial growth for Russia in 2023. Michael Hudson says, well, what Russia wants to do is to turn what is going to be a victory militarily in Ukraine into an overall new economic order. That's what both Putin and Lavrov, and I might add, also President Xi of China, have talked about. And they've also pointed out that economic and political resolutions of the Ukraine conflict go together. So Russia, at the very outset, is going to ask Ukraine and the United States to admit that the fake massacre in Bucha and other accusations of war crimes were faked. And Russia is going to, I would hope, make its own list of Ukrainian, American, and British war crimes against Ukraine, including now the use of depleted uranium, and present its own bill for money that is owed, which probably will be much more. There will be a whole argument about who started the war. Did the war start in 2014 with the coup d'etat and then the successive shelling, I might add, of the Donbass by the military, of Ukraine, shelling civilians, killing 14,000 of them between 2014 and 2022? Or did it start with the buildup of Ukrainian forces to attack Luhansk and Donetsk just before February of last year? Or did it just start with Russia coming in, as every American official document says, unprovoked? I think Michael should have put that one in scare quotes, the unprovoked part. Well, the war crimes trial is going to be run by the Russians, probably with other global South, world majority countries, China, and others. And the objective is going to be to restructure not only NATO Ukraine, but NATO China and U.S. relations with the global majority altogether. He's talking about the global majority population, which is not in the G7 and not in the United States and North America and Europe. The global majority population is in the rest of the world. And increasingly, it is going into the BRICS. It is joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It is creating new alliances which are opposed to the hegemonic agenda of the United States. And those are comments I just added. And what Russia realizes is that whatever comes out of this, whatever peace agreement is negotiated, can only be established on the battlefield. That's why Russia cannot afford to lose the war, and why in the New York Times, Mr. Friedman comes out and says, the world is flat, Mr. Friedman. and says Russia has now expanded right to the tip, of NATO. It's Russia that's expanding to NATO instead of NATO expanding out to Russia. And Michael speaks sarcastically there. So I think what Russia is going to come out with is its own Monroe Doctrine. And it's going to say, keep out of the Black Sea and keep also out of the Northern Pacific. It can coordinate this with China, keeping foreign ships out of the China Straits. The Ukraine war is going to set a whole model for what's happening in Taiwan, in China, and all over the world far outside of Ukraine. A very significant statement, which I think that's very prescient. That is what's going to happen. Because people, once the loss of Ukraine occurs, and it's definitely established that the United States could do nothing about it, at that point, the military prestige of the United States is going to become far less, and other nations are going to be far less careful about what the United States thinks or what the United States is opposed to. And the United States essentially, Michael says, has seized the holdings of Russian oligarchs. And we've talked about seizing Russia's reserves. And these holdings of Russian oligarchs were bought with the money that paid the privatized companies to U.S. and foreign borrowers. So Russia can economically respond by nullifying all foreign holdings of Russian stocks that are held by U.S. holders and NATO holders. Say, wait a minute, you've not only stolen from Ukraine, you've stolen in Russia. Let's have a global settlement of all this. You did to Russia first what you did to Ukraine. We're going to cancel all stocks and bonds owed to U.S. and NATO holders. Simply nullify them to reverse the sell-off of the Russian industry. And that could be a model for the same thing to be done to Ukraine in calculating the damages and reparations that America, Britain, and Germany owe to Ukraine. Mick Dunford then said, yes, I mean, Michael spoke about a new economic order. I think it's quite interesting to ask why, when from the 1990s, Russia put forward proposals for economic integration of Eurasia from Lisbon to Vladivostok, when it spoke about indivisible security, when it expected that the verbal and written commitments made to Gorbachev concerning the non-expansion of NATO would be respected, and we now learn from Jeffrey Sachs that NATO started to plan the inclusion even of Ukraine in 1991, 1992, which is astonishing. But in a sense, these constructive proposals were repudiated by the United States and also by the European Union. An important question one needs to ask is why? This is, I think, still Michael Hudson, or is it? Or are we on Mac now? No, it's Mick Dunford, actually. So Mick is saying, I mean, obviously, there are many reasons and there are complicated explanations, but clearly what the conflict has done is it's disrupted the Belt and Road initiative. It's divided Russia and Germany. It obviously is presumably intended to prevent the emergence of a significant Eurasian land power that could challenge the leadership of the United States. In the case of the EU is only interested in economic integration on its terms, which it says respect its values, but what it means by its values are a political order in which it's easy to interfere externally, and an economic order in which all resources are essentially available to sell to everyone and anyone, which tends to deny less developed parts of the world the prospects of engaging in a form of catch-up development. I think it's in the light of that bitter experience that Russia's formulated a new foreign policy, and that new foreign policy is extremely interesting because it involves, on the one hand, a reorientation of Russia towards the East the establishment of close relationships with East Asia, with Southeast Asia, with uh, India. But it also involves the redefinition of Russia as a, quote, civilization state. I mean, for a long time, since Peter the Great, in other words, since the 1690s, Russia, in a sense, modeled itself on the West. And I think it's the malfeasance of the West that has actually persuaded it that there has to be another way forward. What's the malfeasance of the West? Well, for example, lying to Russia about the expansion of NATO, that malfeasance, the imperialism in Africa, the imperialism in South America, the imperialism in Russia, the looting of Russia after the collapse of the communist state during the 1990s. Going off what Mick says. And in a sense, this notion of civilization state is a notion that's also used in relation to China. You could use it in relation to India, in relation to the countries of the Islamic world, okay, as well. So, and the thing that's quite interesting about it is if you actually say, oh, screw it, sorry, I lost track of that, screwed that up. Okay, so, let me go back to what I was doing here. Okay, and in a sense, this notion of a civilization state is a notion that's also used in relation to China. You could use it in relation to India, in relation to the countries of the Islamic world. And the thing that's quite interesting about it is if you actually say, look, you look at East Asia until 1894, East Asia was at peace for 300 years. If you just look at China, it was at peace for 500 years. These countries did not engage in forms of external expansion and colonialism. So, in a sense, there's a profound difference in the kind of civilization or values of these East Asian civilization and Western civilization in which capitalism emerged, imperialism, and colonialism. And in a sense, that's associated with radically different conception of the international order that I think Russia has now come to in its close relationship with China, and especially in terms of the way in which it's defined its new foreign policy. That, in a sense, is a hope that we might all, in the years ahead, come to live in a more peaceful world in which we're not constantly faced with a succession of wars, as we have been basically in the last 500 years since the rise of Western colonialism and imperialism. Okay, and Radhika Desai Radhika Desai says no. That's exactly the word. The word you ended with is exactly what I was going to talk about because it's about imperialism. You said Jeffrey Sachs noted that the Americans were planning as early as 1990-91 to integrate Ukraine into NATO, etc. The reason for that is essentially what has ruled the world, what has determined how the different parts of the world relate to each other for the last couple of hundred years has been Western imperialism. What do we have? Why do we have Western imperialism? Because of Western capitalism. What is the purpose of Western imperialism? To constantly open up more and more parts of the world so that Western corporations based in the West could have access to markets, to investment opportunities and profit opportunities, and cheap labor um, 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 and materials. Russia has always been seen as a big prize for the West. Essentially, the Anglo American interest, so to speak, the so called liberal and the most aggressively imperialist interest of the West has always looked upon Russia as being too big and therefore that should be broken down. And this is also important. It's also important to talk about this because Western imperialism is often ignored while the Russian Empire or the Chinese Empire, and we are always being told these countries are being imperialist. But as you rightly pointed out, these civilizations have lived peacefully and they have been used to living peacefully for centuries. Whereas what you have seen with the onset of Western capitalism is nothing but endless war, and the purpose of these wars is exactly this. So I think that, and I also like to make one, I completely agree with you, of course, since Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, Russia did look to the West. But the purpose of looking to the West was not, in fact, to model itself on the West, but rather essentially partnered with the West to create Russian prosperity. But because the West is imperialist, it is precisely this prosperity that was not possible in a close relation with the West. And that is, in fact, what's happened when the communist government in the Soviet Union broke down. What did the West immediately try to do to Russia while it was struggling to make the transition to capitalism? The answer is Western businesses and Western economists went into Russia and tried to exploit it and to loot the resources and the raw materials, of Russia. That was what the 1990s were all about. And Russia was then trying to practice a radical form, of capitalism, and 10 to 15 million people in Russia died as a result. Now, The Body Economic, that book, tells the story of how this happened during the 1990s. That is why the pinnacle of Russian productive achievement was under the Soviet Union when it was not, in fact, connected with the West. So, in that sense, I would say that what Russia has realized now, sorry, I clicked too vigorously on that. I'm trying to get back to my place here. Oh, so Radhika says, and this is also important. It is also important to talk about this because Western imperialism, now I read that too previously, so haven't quite gotten back to this. So, in that sense, I would say that what Russia has realized now, and this was very clear in my last visit to Russia, two quick by reminiscences. Number one, we attended a major economic conference, and even like 2 or 3 years ago, that conference would have been dominated by neoliberal intellectuals. This time around, the overwhelming majority of speakers were decidedly anti-neoliberal. There were a couple of neoliberals, but they were sort of one or two in a sea of general consensus about creating a developmental state in Russia, having closer relations with China, and moving away from the West. So that's number one. Number two, another conference I attended began by the chair. Again, this took place in the home of neoliberalism in Russia, which is the Higher School of Economics, which was set up after 1991, precisely to be a sort of beehive for neoliberal thinking. This is where the session began by the chair, essentially the first speaker, essentially saying that when this war ends, Russia will no longer turn to the West. That chapter is finished. Russia is looking to the East. This, friends, is really a monumental reorientation from a historical point of view, because Russia looked to the West for so long. Russia looked to the West, after all, for three hundred years. It identified with Europe for 300 years. Even the communist government did. It looked to the West, okay, in various ways, compared itself to the West, found certain things in the West to be superior, and tried to improve those things. Uh, and the session ended with the chair saying, "The fact of the matter is, Russia does not want to become closer to the West. The West is boring. The East is where everything is happening." So, in that sense, yes, the Washington consensus has now been universally rejected, and the long standing question of whether Russia is European or Eurasian has been decisively settled. And Radica continues, so in this sense, I would say that there are many trends essentially moving in an anti neoliberal direction. There is room for more, and I think Russia can come out of this as a much more productive society, provided it manages to not just build resilience against sanctions, but actually learn how a mixed. The graph showed that in the period since 1989, China has essentially increased its GDP by almost 15 times. Other countries like Russia can do it too. Russia has a lot of potential, but it needs to have the right kinds of policies. I think this is the direction in which the present situation is pushing Russia. And of course, as both of you pointed out, this is creating we sometimes call it a multipolar world. It's certainly dividing the world away from the West and creating new relationships between countries, particularly the closeness between Russia and China is very important. Well, we could say a lot more here, but I don't want to extend this show to 3 hours. I'd like to limit it at this point to only two. Well, the Ukrainian and Russian situation in many ways has inverted. Okay, this is another comment by Michael Hudson. In many ways, has inverted the whole traditional drive of imperialism. You and I, he's talking to Radican now, have spoken for decades about imperialism being economic. And even when Marx talked about British expansion into India, he gave a speech before the Chartists saying, well, at least English imperialism is going to break down the backwardness of India and other countries, and it's going to introduce capitalism, and that will be the first step towards socialism in these countries. That is not what is occurring in Ukraine or in the neoliberal breakup of Russia. And in fact, you can look at Ukraine and Russia in the last 30 years and say the whole geopolitical theory of economic priority, the idea that economics drives politics, doesn't seem to be the case today. Neither industry nor labor is benefiting. You're seeing Germany already agreeing to subsidize the high gas and oil prices to support buying its liquid natural gas from the United States. It's 6 times the price that Russia was charging. That's not economic. You have German industry unable to stop dismantling of German industry by dismantling the energy trade and food trade with Russia. That was what gave German industry its competitive advantage. That's now gone, and that, okay, is irreversible. Not because of anything that President Putin is saying, but because the U.S. demands to turn Europe into a client oligarchy has made it reversible. if the German government supports industry by saying, okay, we're going to give money to the industry so it can depend entirely on the United States for materials we used to import from Russia, then given the fact that we have to balance our budget according to the EU rules, we're going to have to cut back social spending, especially now that we have to vastly increase our arms spending to replace all the old obsolete arms that we've sent to Ukraine with brand new U.S. arms. There really isn't going to be any opportunity for a social democratic economic program in Germany. Well, it's hard to say how economic self interest justifies this inversion, the reversal of European policy, because it's led to America's destruction of German industry. And not only that, but by destroying German industry, you destroy the demand for skilled labor. Are we going to see German labor emigrating just like it has from the Baltic states? 20% loss in population from Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. But there's another thing that's also Europe has lost by this. When Russia and China are turning away from Europe, they're not turning away from the Europe that was going social democratic, from the Europe that actually held out ideals in times past, but from the fact that Europe is no longer social democratic. It's lost its former socialist labor policy. Germany's Die Linke party has broken up over the Ukraine war, and the United States political meddling has turned Europe's social democratic and labor parties into neoliberal proxies, the Tony Blairism of German politics and French politics and all over Europe. So the result is that not only a client political oligarchy, but also a client political labor force. There's no labor movement in Europe to oppose what's happening here. What if economics governed by European policy? Well, after 1991, Europe hoped at least to gain economic dominance over Central Europe, Russia, and as you pointed out, by Ukraine. But now it's losing Eurasia. Annalena Baerbock, she's the foreign minister, okay, of Germany, says that any kind of trade is a risk. And if you trade with Russia or China, she said, then you're taking the risk that they can do to Europe what America does to the rest of the world. They can cut you off with sanctions, disrupt your economy by refusing to export to you, and Europe can only be safe if it doesn't export export or import anything it needs from China or Russia or the rest of the global majority. Only the United States can be depended upon to help Europe to develop, just as it helped Germany develop by blowing up the Nord Stream pipelines and restructuring its energy trade. That, by the way, was sarcasm from Michael Hudson. So this is the craziness of what Germany's foreign minister herself is saying. I don't know how you can ever say that this is an economic explanation of things. The fact is, it's ethnic and racist hatred of Russia. It's Nazism. It's not social democracy. Europe has now embraced Nazism. And I think this is best symbolized over the weekend by the Zelensky's meeting with the Pope, wearing two Nazi symbols on his shirt, just to make it very clear. Hey, maybe we can reestablish the papal Nazi pact of the 1930s and the Red Line and everything. So Europe has lost its profitable investment future with Russia. And now it seems China too, and it's completely tied itself to the United States. How do you explain that economically in terms of self interest? You can't. Okay, and Radhika Desai calls on Mick and says, we're still discussing Russia, right? Michael Hudson says, well, it's Europe too. And Mick Dunford says, I started to talk about Europe. Michael just talked about the way in which some of the decisions, the extraordinary decisions made by the political leaders of European countries, and the ways in which the complete absence, it seems, of any strategic autonomy in Europe has led to actions that make a bad situation worse. They make a bad situation worse in the sense that they've disrupted relationships with Russia, especially energy relationships, food relationships, and also de-risking generates serious risks where Europe is very, very dependent on a whole range of intermediate goods that are actually produced in China and supplied to European industry by China. By European industries, and indeed all the G7 industries, face serious challenges in any case, which are to some extent linked to the fact that after the economic crisis in the 1970s, neoliberalism was in a sense adopted as a solution. It was adopted as a solution in the sense that when you saw this offshoring of industry, you did indeed see increases in the profitability of companies, that offshored. And this graphic shows the decline of labor productivity in the G7 between 1950 and 2000, and 20, actually 2000, and 21. It shows two graphs, one of labor productivity and one of hourly productivity, and they're quite consistent with each other. Very small deviations, but the fact is, that productivity was up around 5 during the 1960s. It started at roughly 4.5. It went down to 2. Then during the 1960s, it shot up to 5. Then it started a secular trend going downwards. By 1975, it had fallen close to 1. Then it shot up again to about 2.5. Then it went down to about 0.5 during the recession of the 1980s. Then it jumped back up again to 2.5. But then the trend down started again. And there's been a secular trend down since then. Actually, productivity fell to close to minus 0.5 in 2020, went up a bit to 0.5 in 2021. But the secular trend has been down from that high, of 5, all the way down. It's a striking graphic. Mick says, but if you actually look at the productivity growth of the G7 countries, this is the average productivity growth, labor productivity, hourly productivity. You can see that it's basically steadily declined. So in a sense, the economic performance of the G7, which includes a number of major European countries, and of course the United States, Canada, and so on, has progressively declined. It's declined because of a decline in productive investment, which partly reflects profitability considerations and the relative profitability of investments in financial activities and a whole series of speculative activities linked to real estate, to stock markets, and so on. In other words, the financialization of a neoliberal economy has resulted in radical declines in productivity of the G7. So the first challenge that Europe faces is, in a sense, the challenge of overcoming the relative decline in productivity. But in seeking to confront that challenge by acting in the way in which it has in the last few years, and in a sense becoming a part of the world that is almost completely dominated by the United States and by its interests, Europe has done itself considerable damage. I think the other thing that's very striking about what is happening as far as Europe is concerned is that because of the way in which the world order is changing, the kind of resources available for the former colonial powers are more diminished. So, in that situation, the United States is seeking to seize a much larger share of these resources for itself by requiring Europe, for example, to purchase expensive U.S. energy rather than Russian energy through new measures which are designed to perhaps encourage the relocation of European industries to the United States. So, in a sense, what you see is a kind of inter imperial rivalry between Europe and the United States, which the United States, exploiting its dominant position in order to secure a greater volume of resources for itself. Okay, and Radhika Desai replies, absolutely, Mick, you use the term inter-imperial by rivalry, but I would say that essentially going back to even the 19th century, certainly in the 20th century, the United States has always wanted to essentially contain or roll back by European imperialisms in order to open up the world economy to itself. That has always been its goal. It's going to continue to attempt this, even though, of course, it is farther away from realization than ever before. The rest of the world economy is turning away from it. We're basically now on to discussing Europe, and I want to say a couple of things about that. I did want to say one final thing about Russia before we leave that topic entirely. That is that basically what is happening now can be explained by what happened to post-communist Russia. Essentially, Russia was plunged into economic chaos and retardation in the 1990s under shock therapy. She should have added under neoliberal shock therapy because that's what it was. And in the 2000s, under Putin's leadership, Putin managed to stabilize Russia to a considerable extent, which, of course, I spoke of while commenting on Mick's first graph about the growth in GDP in all these different nations. But already then it was very clear that if the West had its way, this is what would happen to Russia. What happened to Russia in the 1990s. And in the course of the period over the next 2 decades, what the Putin government tried to do is to say to the West that, look, we would like to have good relations with you, but not on those terms. You have to accept our own interests and naturally economic interests, security interests, and so on. And that possibility is essentially trying to have a more balanced relationship with the West has been destroyed. The West has basically refused it. It has continued to expand at NATO. So now this decisive reorientation of Russia, the realization that the West has no longer anything to offer Russia that is valuable, this is, this has that history. Coming to Europe, to me, the headline in terms of discussing what's happening in Europe is, are they crazy? Why are they undertaking such a suicidal policy where their industrial base is being destroyed, as Michael, you pointed out? And also the industrial base is being destroyed now quite actively with the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, the cutting off of the most sensible source of energy for Europe, which is energy from Russia. And then they're making, moreover, Europe reliant on energy from the United States, which not only is more expensive, so creating economic problems, but also setting back Europe back from its climate goals, because imported LNG shipped from the United States to Europe will have a carbon footprint which is 8 times higher than natural gas being supplied by pipeline from Russia. So in all of these ways, the Europeans seem to be intent on a degree of self-destruction that I think is amazing. And I still don't understand what animates it. But I can certainly know 2 things. Number one, there is considerable public discontent And number two, there is also a presumed, I think there is a fair degree of discontent in the elite classes because the industrialist interests are being destroyed as well. So, what is going to happen to Europe is an open question. Certainly, we can see the Europeans, they may have gone along with, or at least they may have appeared to go along with the United States with imposing sanctions and so on. But if you look closely at the sanctions, they're also designed to minimize the impact on Europe. And the fact of the matter is, Europe's reliance on Russian energy may have decreased, but Russian energy is still being pumped to Europe even as we speak. Yeah, the way it's being pumped to Europe is through India, actually. In other words, India is getting the Russian oil and it's reselling it, but to Europe. But in terms of extending this hostility, well, that makes it three times more expensive. But in terms of extending this hostility that is now being directed from Europe to Russia, we can see that the Europeans are certainly hesitating and looking at that. So there is that dimension. We will have to see how long this unity that the West has proclaimed, the unity they have found over the conflict over Ukraine, how long it will last, and how long it will be before the economic hurt that's being inflicted on Europe will essentially produce some kind of pushback. And Michael Hudson said, well, Radica, you asked the question, are they crazy? Well, in a way, yes. They are, in the same sense that you and I each have gone to the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation meetings in Berlin, and I spent quite a bit of time in East Germany. They were traumatized by the Soviet occupation there, so traumatized that it's almost an unthinking opposition to anything that Russia does. And it's this anti Russian feeling that America has been able to fan and encourage that has led the Germans to say, yes, we're willing to sacrifice our industry. We saw what happened under Russia. Now let's turn to the United States, not realizing that what the United States is doing is going to be equally bad as what happened in East Germany. They were tapping Angela Merkel's phones. They're still wiretapping. My main source of Russian information is Johnson's Russia list. Johnson just went to France to take a vacation 2 weeks ago. Said that he was surprised to find that you can't get any access to RT or Russian news on the internet. Everything is blocked. There's total thought control in Russia. This again is a total inversion of everything that was supposed to be democratic. And this is pushed to the really insane point that when Baerbock says anything we import from Russia or China can potentially be used for the military. If you import Russian food, that could be used to feed Russian soldiers to fight in Ukraine, and so that food is military. We can't rely on that for national security purposes on that. We've got to follow the Dutch and not permit the exportation of ultraviolet scanning machinery to information technology chips. We've got to really break off all trade. Well, as you know, when so much trade is already with Russia and China and Eurasia, having a sharp cutoff is going to mean a prolonged depression there. And there's no indication that a European depression is going to lead to a left-wing solution. If the U.S. has its way, it will lead to a 1930 Nazi-type solution, just as the U.S. has promoted in Ukraine and in the other countries that it's taken forward. So Europe may end up looking like a Latin American dictatorship, like Chile under Pinochet. And McDunford says, one also needs to recognize that in some respects, the structure of the economies of Europe, have some parallels with the structures of the economies of North America. They're economies with very high GDPs, but actually their GDP enormously overstates their real wealth in many ways, in part because the GOP includes all sorts of imputations. It includes a whole series of immaterial services, basically derived from intangible assets associated with what copyright, patent, trademarks, intellectual property rights, and the control of supply chains. So a significant amount of European wealth, in a sense, derives also from those sorts of sources. This control over IP, for example, is associated with excessive markups, high service payments. It prevents a diffusion of technologies, of products that could make considerable contributions to the improvement of human livelihoods throughout the world because they remain so expensive. In fact, we know that what, in a sense, drives development is the rapid diffusion, adoption, by repetition of investments. But this system, prevents it. But this system is one which generates large rents, for economically advanced countries, and associated with these rents are a lot of interests not connected with manufacturing industry and maybe that seem prepared to sacrifice it and to sacrifice the people who work in it to preserve some alternative kind of future. To me, that world is scarcely viable outside of a kind of colonial and imperial world order. And in that sense, I agree absolutely with what you're saying about the naivete and apparent stupidity, gross stupidity of many of the leaders of European countries. So that's now what Mick is saying. And Radhika says, no, exactly, and you make a very important point, Mick. The GDP of many Western countries, particularly the United States, is vastly exaggerated for the reasons you state, and also because finance in particular constitutes such a large part of this. Essentially, what is finance? Finance is actually not production. Finance only involves the transfer of wealth from some to others. Here I have to comment. If we're talking about finance as private sector finance, basically bank activity or the investments of rich people, in other areas, those things are going on in the private sector, and they are about the transfer of wealth from some people in the private sector to other people, in the private sector. The finance itself isn't actually production. Now, it may finance some of that, but increasing financialization, in nations that is based only, on monetary profits. Where do those monetary profits come from? They don't come from the government. It's one part of the private sector or one part of the foreign sector trying to profit at the expense of another part of the private sector or another part of the private sector. So, in other words, you're trying to make profits off the backs of poor people, either domestically or through imperialism in other nations. That's what we're basically talking about here. That doesn't increase the real wealth of anybody. It only increases the monetary wealth of the elites. That's what it does. So to go back to what Mick was saying, finance only involves the transfer of wealth from some to others. So that, in a certain sense, the very thing which is harming the U.S. economy, which is creating inequality, is actually counted as economic wealth. I shouldn't actually say economic wealth, but as it adds to GDP. So that part, of GDP that is doing that is not doing anything good for society. It's not enriching society. It's turning societies into to oligarchies. It's extracting wealth from certain parts of the population and delivering monetary wealth to other parts of the population. And of course, the making of financial profits only benefits a small number of people to enjoy the labor of other people for next to nothing. I mean, that's essentially what it is. I also want to say one other thing, which is obviously one of the implications of what all of us have been saying, is that it is important today. You showed, Kay, the labor productivity graph. What would be required to turn that around? What would be required to increase labor productivity in European countries, Western countries more generally? It would be some kind of industrial policy. It would be a set of policies which are totally the opposite of neoliberalism. Uh, Also, monetary policies, fiscal policies, industrial policies, everything the opposite of neoliberalism. But after 40 years of applying neoliberalism, it is a moot question whether these countries are ever going to be in a position to be able to implement serious industrial policy. The very structure of these societies, the relationship between states and capitalist classes, has changed to such an extent. So increasingly, I've been noting it both in the United States and in Europe, industrial policy is being revived as a topic of discussion. Everybody's saying we need industrial policy, but if you look closely, if you read between the lines, Radica says, what is passing for industrial policy is essentially a policy which is neoliberalism, which is to say, giving more and more subsidies to big corporations. So the Germans, under the rubric of industrial policy, are essentially discussing whether they should give subsidies to IBM or some German manufacturers of or what have you. That's all it is, and that's not industrial policy. It's just the continuation of neoliberalism. Why? Because neoliberalism, for all the talk of free markets and free trade, has ever been only about governments favoring big corporations by giving them all sorts of goodies, cheap credit, privatizing assets at fire sale prices so these companies can get ever bigger, giving them subsidies in the name of R&D, and of course, providing all sorts of other services. So really, it seems as though the road out of all of this for Europe is also going to be very difficult, even if there arise forces that are determined to seek to attempt that. What you've described as neoliberalism is exactly what Mick has called a rentier policy. Okay, and a rentier policy pretends to be economic growth, but it's really just overhead. Okay, and Radhika Desai says, absolutely. So we will bring this ninth geopolitical economy hour to an end and see you next time. We'll continue this discussion then. Bye bye, she says. But I'm not quite saying bye bye yet. I have something else to add, which I think is very important. Obviously, you see that I agree with a great deal of what they've said. But when you raise the important point of how are we going to get industrial policies, real industrial policies, into societies like ours, into European societies, okay, and into the United States, into Canada, and into other societies that are run by the oligarchies in accordance with neoliberal types, okay, of ideologies. The way we are going to get rid of that is to free the government from the oligarchs. And the way you do that is by dumping the corruption in government. And the way you do that is by making big money contributions to politicians toxic to the politicians themselves. And the way you do that is by making that a litmus test. Anybody who accepts any big money from any sources has got to be voted down. If they're candidates, they have to be defeated. We have to vote against them. If they're office holders, they also have to be defeated. We have to kick them out of office. We can only vote for candidates who run their campaigns based on small donations alone. That has to be an ironclad rule. When we get people into legislatures and into the leadership of societies who are not bought by the oligarchs, not bought by the neoliberals, they will then be free to get rid, of neoliberalism. Until that happens, we will not get rid, of neoliberalism. We would not have the industrial policy that we need. Why is it that we see these huge developments in China? Why is it that we see all this growth with very little inflation? Because they're not a neoliberal system. Why is it that we're beginning to see very strong growth and resiliency in Russia? Because they're not a neoliberal system. They've adopted a mixed system in which capitalism serves increasingly the public purpose. Especially in China, this is the case. But we can't have policy serving the public purpose until we get people inside of our legislatures, inside of the other branches of government that are unbought by the big money. So that's what I have to say for now. If there are any comments, I will consider those comments. Have you got any comments?
Very good. I thought it was a very good, very thorough, extremely thorough, going over everything.
Yeah, I thought it was amazing. It was just amazing, the breadth of the vision that they were presenting. Going from country to country like that and talking about the whole dynamics, of neoliberalism, the geopolitical dynamics was just so compelling.
It was, and especially, we've lived through all this, and if you've had an interest in foreign policy, you've watched a lot of it. You've watched the history, the rise and the fall, and yes, and the U.S. always goes in. The corporations always go in, no matter what country it is, to steal, steal, steal. Pick you when you're down.
Yes. Yes, I know. It was very. That's what happens when the corporations are free to exercise what they want without much interference from the various governments. That's the essence, of neoliberalism. Only things the neoliberals want from governments is for the governments not to regulate them and for governments to give them subsidies. That's all they want. And when that's what happens, what it does is create these oligarchies that run countries into the ground.
We've seen that over and over again.
And that's what we've been getting, and that's what is ending, in the process of ending in a good part of the world, today. And the only way to defeat it in our part of the world is to throw out the politicians
Exactly.
who have been bought by them. Uh, okay, hang on a second. Bonnie needs to do something immediately. Okay, I'll be right back. Okay, give me that, honey.
Says $670 from PayPal. I didn't order this.
Like we said here, I'm high on how Joe tied everything into a sensible crescendo that describes our neoliberal demise and how to prevent hitting rock bottom by ultimately dumping the corruption. That
Did
is
you order this?
No,
that is a
what
fact.
it is.
Something we've been witnessing and yeah, it seems like everything brings us back to dumping the corruption.
Okay,
We have
this
to
is a
dump the
fraud.
corruption.
There's nothing to cancel. Just ignore it. It's a fish.
And what if PayPal? I've got PayPal.
But you don't have
Good to
any
see Greg
money.
here. I don't know if Greg's still here. Greg showed up at 10:26.
Okay, check your PayPal account out, but don't do it in connection with the email you just got. In other words, just look up what's going on in your PayPal account.
I haven't touched PayPal in years.
Yeah, go into it on that machine, not on your iPad. Go into it on the big machine. Okay, folks. So you were saying, D? I'm sorry I missed it.
I was going to say, I'd like to comment that Andy made. I'm high on how Joe tied everything into a sensible crescendo that describes our neoliberal demise and how to prevent hitting rock bottom by ultimately dumping the corruption.
Thank you, Andy. I appreciate that comment. Uh, okay, but well, I think that what I said at the end was important. I think the whole live stream by Radica and Mick and Michael Hudson was just a wonderful situation, just a wonderful exposition, okay, of the economic dynamics that are connected to the Ukraine war. Okay, at this point, it was so very wide ranging and so very strong about the implications, okay, of everything. The emphasis on the historic nature of the reorientation, okay, of Russia from west to east is so important. So important. I can't say enough about how important that is. And I suppose that comes. I'm someone who, at one point in my life, I studied Russia very, very closely. I almost tried to become a Russian expert. I didn't do that because I didn't want to limit myself to one area. Uh, I was interested more in the systems theory, okay, of international politics. But I studied a lot, okay, of Russian history, okay, a lot of it, going way, way back. To the establishment of the first of the dynasties in Russia, okay, which was in Kiev, actually. The first of the Russian states was in Kiev, which is very interesting, of course, for all sorts of reasons. But attempts, but through the years, to turn to the West and to come to terms with Western civilization, that has been a historical imperative, actually, for Russia. For so long, they've considered this kind of imperative to catch up to the West. And now they're simply rejecting that, and they're building a different kind of economy. And that is so hopeful. Okay, it is really so hopeful, okay, I think. Now, I'm not sure about the speculation that the Eastern countries, which had lived in peace for so long before, will continue to live in peace again. I'd like to see a better analysis of why they lived in peace, okay, for so long. Okay, I think the tie-in of conflict to the emergence of capitalism is very, very important. But I also think that capitalism is not the only source, okay, of conflict between nations. I think there are other sources of conflict as well. There are other things in the human experience that cause conflict, which are apart, okay, from capitalism. So I'd like to see the theory of those speculations developed, okay, a lot more than they were um, in the discussions in this particular stream. But I certainly think that it's hopeful that if the world becomes dominated by the Eastern powers, that there may indeed be less conflict. And I certainly look forward to that, and it's very important, okay, at present, because we all have to come together to solve the climate emergency. And we must do this very, very soon. We all know that. By the way, I heard something today that gave me pause. Specifically, Robert Kennedy that came back on to the Breaking Points program. Okay. Okay. And he said a number of times on that program that he believes in free market capitalism. And he has said a lot of hopeful things, but that really bothered me. That really bothered me. Because free market capitalism is not possible. It's an ideal that is not possible. It's just not possible in our society. Free market capitalism always leads to concentration, corporations. I know that Bobby Kennedy intends to stop that through regulation. And he can have a lot of success at that. But he has to recognize that when the theorists talk about free market capitalism, They're not talking about regulation. That's not free market capitalism. That's something else. He needs to stop confusing people about that. If he intends to have a very strong regulatory regime, it's only a step from such a regime to strong industrial policy by the government. And that is what is needed, because free market capitalism is always going to be subject to market failures of this kind or that kind, okay, the other kind. And very often it's necessary for the government to produce things to fulfill, okay, the needs of the public. And that kind of activity is not free market capitalism. It is socialism, pure and simple. And I'm surprised to find that Robert Kennedy doesn't appear to understand that. Surprised and dismayed. Well, let's soften another track for tonight, and I didn't want to make this a 3-hour show. Okay, Dee, you have any more comments?
I just was so impressed with everything you brought forth. And I just hope more people will be able to either watch this stream or watch, the original.
Okay, this stream is very hard to put into clips because of the way everything is interrelated. I mean,
Right.
it could be put into clips, but it can be easily put into clips, actually, because the clips could be about Ukraine clip. There could be a Russian clip. There could be a European clip, and so on. But the real benefit of the stream is not the individual sections or the individual clips, but their interrelations and the overall vision about what is going on in the international system. That's what was so important about that stream. And the only way for people to get that is to, really see that whole stream. I think they can get it from my reconstruction of the stream here and some additional comments that I made that were not a part of the original stream and that are worth considering. But
It's just a matter of sharing this out a lot. We'd have to share this out a lot.
Yeah, I think we are going to have to share this out a lot and really spread it. Now, Greg Mallett said, I had a really great time with the Green Party US during the webinar tonight I attended. I'm really happy to hear that, Greg. Okay, I think the Green Party could very well go on a roll in these next 2 years. I certainly hope to see it. Okay, of all the third parties, okay, I really like them the best. Why do I like them the best? Well, off the experience I've had with them, and it's been sketchy experience, I haven't been deeply involved, but in interviews I've had and other interviews I've seen and things like that. Okay, I think the People's Party is autocratically run by Nick Brana. And I don't think parties, should be run as an autocracy. I think they need to be democratic from the bottom up. I think the Green Party is closer to that than any of the other third parties that I know about. Greg Mallard says we're going to be doing a major tweet storm starting tomorrow regarding candidates running along with Cornel West stuff. Who's we, Greg?
Tim Black had interviewed Cornel West today on his show, and then he showed it, I think, twice. It was quite
Yeah, I
interesting.
think Cornel West has been very impressive in his interviews so far. Okay, from what I've seen, uh, he really did a number on Jake Tapper, okay, at CNN.
Sure, he did. He's so good.
Yeah, he really did a number on Jake Tapper. That was terrific. Okay, so I think he's essential for this campaign. His messaging is essential for this campaign. I still don't know that on the positive side that he's the best candidate for reasons that I've stated earlier. But he's certainly the most inspirational candidate
Mhm.
so far. I think that is certainly true. Okay, but I also have to say that Marianne Williamson is a very good speaker, and she's capable of giving very exciting speeches. Okay, as well.
Talk about, and that's the one thing with Cornel West. He really brings forth, issues with foreign policy and links and compares with the USA, and then with Palestinians, the Palestinian issue. He's very strong, so he gets
Uh,
people thinking.
yeah, he's very strong on almost all the issues and very principled. Okay, on almost all the issues. But I don't know how strong he is when it comes to economics. Okay, I don't know how strong he is. Uh, I don't know how strong he would be as a in terms of management of the federal bureaucracy. I'm not talking about simply technical management. You can hire someone to do that for you, but a great president combines the leadership function and the other management functions in one, and also the political functions. Okay, of a great leader. That's what made Franklin Roosevelt such a great leader. Uh,
I think, he's got the energy and he's just so exciting.
yeah,
I hope they can work together.
energy. He's got the energy, and he is so exciting. So Greg says that he's on a Twitter chat with people who are with the Green Party of the United States. That's great. And he says Laura Fielding is also going to be on the tweet storm coming. Well, if Laura's in on it, that's going to be much better for the success of that particular tweet storm. Okay, I hope that Pepper Lewis, who goes under the handle of O Lightworker now, is also going to be involved. She gave up her Twitter account, so her followers are not as overwhelming, not that high anymore. They once were very, very high. But she knows how to do tweet storms. She knows how to make things trend. So I hope that O Lightworker gets involved in that tweet storm. And Greg says, yep, us Red Berets are going to rock this thing. Okay, I'll probably get involved in it then also. Okay, well, thank you very much, Dee, and
Well,
thank you
thank
very much,
you.
Greg, and thank you very much, Andy Candy and Steve Wolfbrandt. Uh, yeah, I do hope that we can market this, aftermarket it, and get people to watch it because I think it is a very important stream.
It is very important that people, for the most part, like you said, that they've been left in the dark. The media has never really explained things to them. You know, we've always said what's going to happen to the American people when the truth comes out, or if they ever hear the truth.
Okay, I'm going to say good night.
Yes, good
I
night.
have
Thank
shot
you.
my bolt for tonight. Okay, so thank you, Dee.
Good night. Good night, Bonnie.
Good
Good night,
night.
everybody.
Good night,
Yes,
everybody.
enjoy what you've got to say about hitting the like button, subscribing, and sharing. And
And please buy us coffees.
yep, buy us a coffee.
Yeah,
And
buy
there
us
goes
coffees.
yeah, Greg says, buckle up, everyone.
Yeah.
Okay, good night, everybody.
Okay, good night, Dee.